Self-regulation is often framed as an individual capacity, something the nervous system should be able to do on its own with enough insight, discipline, or practice. From a somatic perspective, this framing is incomplete. The human nervous system did not evolve to regulate in isolation. It evolved in relationship. Physiological regulation is inherently relational. From infancy onward, safety is learned through contact, through being held, mirrored, attuned to, and responded to. The body organizes its internal rhythms in response to signals outside itself. Breath, heart rate, muscle tone, and emotional states all synchronize through shared presence long before conscious self-control is possible. This relational foundation does not disappear in adulthood, it becomes implicit. When regulation is attempted in isolation, the nervous system often compensates through effort. Control replaces connection. Techniques substitute for safety. While these strategies can create temporary stability, they require ongoing management and vigilance. The body remains subtly braced, monitoring itself rather than resting into regulation. True self-regulation emerges not from separation, but from inclusion. When the body senses a larger field of presence, whether through another person, a regulated environment, or a spacious awareness, it no longer has to carry the full burden of stability alone. Regulation becomes distributed. Effort softens. Defensive loops begin to unwind. This is why surrender is not collapse or passivity, but a biological shift. As the nervous system recognizes that it is held within something larger than itself, it releases the need to self-contain every fluctuation. Regulation stops being forced and starts being allowed. What appears as self-regulation is revealed as a relational capacity internalized through safety, resonance, and shared presence. Fear does not dissolve through reasoning, reassurance, or control. From a somatic perspective, fear persists when the nervous system experiences itself as separate, alone, or solely responsible for survival. Even when external conditions improve, fear can remain active if the body continues to perceive itself as the primary point of containment. Connection to source shifts this perception at a physiological level. Source, in this context, is not an idea, belief, or spiritual concept, but a lived sense of being held within something larger than the individual system. When this connection is felt, not imagined, the nervous system no longer organizes around self-protection in the same way. The body senses continuity rather than isolation.
Fear is fundamentally a response to perceived fragmentation. It arises when the system believes that loss, threat, or overwhelm must be managed alone. As connection to source stabilizes, this assumption softens. The body recognizes that it is not the sole container of experience, energy, or responsibility. Support is implicit rather than sought. This recognition is not dramatic or transcendent. It is quiet and biological. Muscular guarding eases. Breath deepens without instruction. Vigilance loses its purpose. The nervous system stops scanning for threat because the context of experience has changed. Presence expands beyond the boundary of the individual body. In this state, fear does not need to be eliminated. It simply loses its organizing role. Sensation can move without being interpreted as danger. Uncertainty becomes tolerable because it is no longer carried alone. Connection to source does not remove challenge or intensity, but it dissolves the contraction that makes fear dominant. The body rests not because circumstances are perfect, but because separation has softened into belonging. Spiritual presence is often approached as a mental or perceptual state, an insight into unity, awareness, or truth. From a somatic perspective, presence becomes meaningful only when it is registered as safety in the body. Without this physiological translation, spiritual realization remains abstract, and the nervous system continues to organize around protection. Somatic safety is not created through belief or affirmation. It emerges when the body senses that it is no longer under immediate demand. In this state, vigilance softens, muscular tension eases, and breath settles without instruction. Presence becomes inhabitable rather than observed. The body no longer braces against experience or prepares for what might go wrong next. When spiritual presence is lived somatically, it functions as a stabilizing field rather than a peak state. The nervous system stops oscillating between seeking and guarding. Awareness is no longer something the mind reaches for. It becomes the environment the body rests within. This is not transcendence of sensation, but inclusion of it.
Sensation is allowed to move without being interpreted as threat. Safety in this context does not mean the absence of intensity, emotion, or challenge. It means the body no longer experiences these as evidence of danger. Presence remains stable through discomfort because the system is not alone inside it. The body senses continuity rather than fragmentation. Spiritual presence, when embodied, dissolves the false divide between inner awakening and biological regulation. Awareness becomes the condition in which the nervous system can finally release effort. What the body recognizes as safety is not control, certainty, or explanation, but the lived experience of being held. In this holding, surrender occurs naturally, not as collapse, but as trust restored at the level of sensation. The ego is often treated as a psychological structure to be transcended or dismantled through insight. From a somatic perspective, ego is more accurately understood as a pattern of nervous system organization shaped around protection. It forms when regulation is experienced as something that must be managed internally and alone. The ego is not the problem, it is the strategy the body adopted when safety was inconsistent. Awareness does not replace this strategy through force or understanding. The nervous system cannot reorganize through insight alone. What softens egoic control is co-regulation, the experience of being met, accompanied, and stabilized through another regulated presence. In co-regulation, the body learns that it does not have to maintain vigilance by itself. Regulation becomes shared. This shared regulation creates a bridge. As the nervous system senses support outside itself, the need for constant self-monitoring begins to ease. Muscular holding relaxes, thought loops slow. Attention naturally widens beyond personal narrative and control. What was previously organized as me managing my experience gradually opens into awareness as environment rather than effort. Co-regulation does not eliminate individuality or agency. Instead, it provides the safety required for awareness to become stable and embodied. Without this safety, awareness remains fleeting, accessed only in moments of stillness or retreat. With it, awareness becomes continuous and lived. Over time, the patterns once labeled as ego are no longer needed to maintain coherence. The nervous system has learned a new orientation, one that includes relationship, presence, and support.
In this way, co-regulation becomes the somatic bridge from egoic survival to awareness as ground. The shift is not conceptual or dramatic. It is quiet, biological, and enduring. Survival is not merely a response to threat. It is a persistent orientation of the nervous system organized around readiness. When this orientation dominates, life is lived from vigilance, effort, and anticipation. Trust, from a somatic perspective, does not arise as a belief or decision. It emerges as a biological state when survival no longer feels necessary. Surrender is often misunderstood as giving up control or becoming passive. Somatically, surrender is the moment the nervous system recognizes that control is no longer required. It is not something the body is instructed to do. It is something that occurs when safety becomes reliable. As this recognition settles, the body begins a descent out of survival, not abruptly, but gradually. This descent is marked by a shift in physiology. Muscles release their chronic readiness. Breath deepens without effort. The constant scanning for what might go wrong loses its urgency. The system moves from mobilization into settling, from bracing into inhabiting. Trust appears not as confidence in outcomes, but as the absence of compulsion to manage them. Importantly, this descent is not upward or transcendent. It moves downward into the body, into sensation, weight, and contact. Awareness becomes grounded rather than elevated. Presence stabilizes not through clarity, but through rest. The nervous system learns that it can remain here without needing to prepare for escape. Trust and surrender, in this sense, are not moral or spiritual achievements. They are indicators that survival is no longer organizing experience. When the body no longer needs to hold itself together through effort, surrender happens naturally. What remains is not collapse, but a deeper coherence, life lived from regulation rather than defense, and awareness expressed through ease rather than vigilance. Awakening, from a somatic perspective, is not a realization the mind arrives at, but a reorganization the body undergoes when safety becomes stable. The nervous system does not awaken through insight, effort, or transcendence. It awakens when it no longer has to protect itself in isolation. Throughout this chapter, surrender has been revealed not as a loss of agency, but as a biological response to being held. When the body senses reliable support, through relationship, presence, or a larger field of awareness, defensive strategies soften.
Vigilance loses its necessity. The system no longer organizes around readiness, but around rest. This holding is not symbolic or conceptual. It is felt. Muscular tone shifts, Breath settles. Sensation becomes inhabitable rather than overwhelming. Awareness stabilizes not because it is understood, but because the body can remain present without bracing. What has often been described as spiritual awakening becomes at its core a physiological permission to stop guarding. Importantly, being held does not remove intensity, emotion, or challenge from life. It changes how they are experienced. Sensation moves without being interpreted as threat. Uncertainty is tolerable because it is shared. The body no longer carries the full weight of experience alone. In this context, awakening is not an event, peak, or permanent state to maintain. It is an orientation. A lived condition in which the nervous system trusts its environment enough to rest inside experience. When the body feels held, awareness no longer needs to be accessed. It is already here. Presence ceases to be something practiced and becomes something lived. The body awakens not by reaching upward but by settling into belonging.